Now we will look at some terms and concepts related to risk. So the terms that we are going to discuss are threat, threat agent, threat event, threat vector, asset, vulnerability, then attack, breach, exposure, risk, and a control or a safeguard or a countermeasure. So what is a threat? Threat is anything that has the potential to violate the security of a asset. So we have a asset here, which is a server, and the threat that we are considering is unauthorized access. Now, threat always originates from a threat agent or a threat source. In this example, we have taken the hacker is the threat agent, and through the internet, the hacker is doing an unauthorized scanning of the asset, which is our server. So, the unauthorized scan of the server network is the threat event in this case, and the medium through which the threat is materializing, that is the internet, that is the threat vector. Now, the asset, which is a server we have considered, it has a vulnerability. The operating system has a remote code execution related vulnerability, and for that, a patch is supposed to be installed. The required security patch is missing. So that is the vulnerability of the server that we have considered. So the hacker is doing an unauthorized network scan, and the hacker identifies this vulnerability. Now this vulnerability has to be exploited. So for that, the hacker uses different tools to exploit that vulnerability. So attempting to exploit that vulnerability using different tools, that is the threat event in this case. And when the attacker is trying to exploit the vulnerability, we call that as an attack. The hacker or the threat agent has not yet succeeded in exploiting the vulnerability, but an attempt is going on. So when an attempt is going on to exploit a vulnerability by a threat, that is termed as an attack. Now, if the vulnerability exploitation is successful, then we call it as a breach or a penetration or a intrusion. So we can say a successful attack is termed as a breach. Now, when a breach occurs or when a threat has successfully exploited a vulnerability, we will have certain losses. We will have certain losses on the asset, or we will have certain losses to the organization. So the one-time losses that we face when a threat exploits a vulnerability, that is termed as a exposure. So exposure is often defined in terms of the asset value. This many percent exposure will be this many percentage of asset value. That is how we define. If the exposure is 25% of asset value, it means if the threat exploits the vulnerability, we are likely to lose 25% of the asset value. Now, once you have an exposure, it will lead to risk. So exposure is the one-time losses that we face or we may face when a threat exploits a vulnerability, whereas the risk is the yearly losses that we face or that we may face due to a threat and a vulnerability. So to calculate the risk, we have to also calculate what is called as likelihood, which means determining how frequently the threat occurs every year. So exposure multiplied by likelihood, that is what gives you your risk. So in short, we can say exposure is talking about one-time losses when the threat exploits vulnerabilities, and the risk is talking about the yearly losses that we face when a threat exploits a vulnerability. And finally, once you come up with the risk, then the next step is trying to identify the control that is required to bring down that risk to acceptable levels. So controls, safeguards, countermeasures. There are different names for the same thing. These are mechanisms that we implement in order to bring down the risk to acceptable levels. So when we are discussing about risk assessment and management, we said the primary focus of risk management is to bring down the risk to acceptable levels. Now, risk is directly related to the threat and vulnerability, or we can say it is related to the impact. So severity of harm means one time impact, and probability of harm means the likelihood, how frequently the threat occurs every year. So what is given here is the two ways in which risk can be represented. Risk can be represented as a function of threat and vulnerability, because ultimately it is the threat and vulnerability that leads to exposure and the likelihood. Or it can also be written as risk is equal to probability of harm times severity of harm. We will meet again in the coming videos with more topics, and thank you all for watching this video.